Back in the summer of 2021, I sat down with Revolo's CEO for a conversation about peptide therapeutics. And that was before peptide therapeutics were even cool, at least before they were as cool as they are now. But Revolo isn't a Me Too player in the peptide crazed metabolic space. Its lead candidate, 1104, is a phase 2B novel linear peptide in the allergy arena. And that candidate is closely followed by a phase 2 molecule called 1805 in the autoimmune disease rheumatoid arthritis. These are big indications, and the guy leading their charge today isn't the same guy I sat down with back in 21. Dr. Woody Bryan, CEO there since January 24, has been with the company since he joined as chief business officer in 2020. He brought with him a host of startup biotech experience, and he's leaned into that experience as he's set a new course at Revolo, beginning with a significant shift in the way the company's drugs are administered. I'm Matt Pillar, and on today's episode of The Business of Biotech, we're going to get to know Dr. Woody Bryan. We're going to study the business impact of drug delivery decisions, and we're going to learn how far Revolo has come over the past 3 years and where it's going next. Dr. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure to have you. I've been excited about this conversation since we chatted a couple of weeks back. And as I mentioned, you joined Revolo as chief business officer several years ago. Then you were promoted at some point to president. I think it was president and chief business officer. And then earlier this year, you became CEO. So I want to start with that transition, sort of how that unfolded over the past 4 years. How'd you end up at Revolo? And then kind of walk us through the progression of your leadership there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually joined in summer of 2020. And, you know, my career is progressed from being actually starting in the industry with a drug delivery background, and then progressing through management responsibility across broader operations that span sort of pharmaceutical development, and then into the corporate development, licensing, sort of strategy side. And so I knew the CEO that had been named in spring of 2020, and he was looking for someone that could come in and wear a number of hats. And, you know, in a company that's a small, early phase to mid phase company where you wear a lot of hats, right? So I think my background and what the company needed at the time was to build out an organization that could set strategy, move the assets through, build value, obviously for shareholders, and advance the programs. Was a nice fit for one another. And so I came in and as chief business officer, obviously helping build the team, helping finance the company, setting strategy, and then implementing that strategy was a natural progression to sort of the title of president. And we've come a long way. You know, our lead asset, 1104, at the time I joined, was a preclinical asset. We had never generated any efficacy data. It was a very early stage, very exciting asset. And here we stand today, 4+ years later. We've completed 5 studies in humans, one a phase 2 EOE study, an allergen sensitivity study, and we've also been able to bring along, if you will, other attributes of the program, like routes of delivery, that give us multiple levers for high product differentiation in the allergic disease, Th2 disease landscape.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've got some questions for you about those multiple hats that you've worn from day one of your start in industry. Cause it's an interesting story to me, and I want to kind of drill into that. But before we do, you know, you talked about one of the major changes over the course of time here in recent years with 1104 at Revolo being that therapeutic delivery route. So I want to stay there for a minute. As I mentioned, I had the liberty, the advantage of a chat with you a few weeks ago, and I'm using your words, not mine, when I say you referred to yourself as an old drug delivery guy. I don't think you meant that literally. I mean, you're not that old a guy. Um, but as it relates to this lead candidate at Revolo and the change that you initiated in its route of administration, I want to learn about that change, what prompted it, maybe the process that Revolo had to go through to enable it, and then why, from a sort of the business impact standpoint that you just referenced, right? Like how it differentiates what you guys are doing in the allergy space. So yeah, so let's start with sort of the genesis of that thought process. Like, hey, we might want to look at going sub Q.
Yeah, so if you step back for a moment, there's been a evolution of different types of molecules that have come into a number of spaces. But if you look at the inflammation space that we're playing in, immunology in general, where you had these older generation steroids and immunosuppressants that granted, brought some therapeutic benefit, but had all sorts of baggage from a safety standpoint. Many of them delivered orally back in the day or other routes of administration. And then in the last 10 or 12 years, you had the biologics come in, the monoclonal antibodies, you had the JAK inhibitors as well. And the monoclonals, just by what they are, chemistry-wise, they're too large to be delivered by anything other than subcutaneous administration. And they brought, again, some nice improvement in efficacy. But having to self-administer sub-Q injection is not a walk in the park for everyone, although technology is made it a little bit more patient-friendly. And then you have the oral JAKs that are delivered orally, but they have black box warnings, all sorts of side effects. So people are constantly battling with, do I, lean into the benefit of the efficacy they bring to the table, but worry about liver function and immunosuppression and things that go on the downside. So that is sort of a baseline of thought around the fact that if you're developing an entity like 1104, it is a peptide, but we had generated some data early on in some animal models that suggested that it's unique in the fact that we saw evidence we could deliver it intravenously, which we started with in the clinic, which is pretty natural for a new entity. You want to take it in the clinic, see if you have a drug or not, and then optimize how you deliver it from a commercial image standpoint. We also had evidence that we could deliver it subcutaneously, and we had a small data set in an animal model we use that suggests we might could deliver it sublingually in the oral cavity. But what we had not done, and we hesitated to do, when I joined, we were still using intravenous in the clinic to say, hey, we've got a signal here. Our preclinical suggested, that we should take this in the clinic, and now we have a drug because it works. So once we generated that data set in our EOE study and our allergen sensitivity study, we turned our attention to saying, okay, now's the time for us to really, really move forward in developing commercially viable subcutaneous dosage form. And hey, while we're doing it, this early data we generated really tells us we should do the same from a sublingual standpoint. Because if you look at the competitive landscape, EOE, you've got Dupixent, which is delivered weekly by subcutaneous injection. And then you've got oral steroids that nobody wants to take chronically because they have a lot of side effects and chronic concerns. So the ability for us to bring a sub-Q into that space as a first generation and deliver it, our data suggests we could dose it possibly every 2 weeks, maybe as infrequent as every 4 weeks, we think can be very competitive and can be a nice alternative to the patient. If we bring an oral into that category, our sublingual data suggests that we could deliver it possibly orally once a week, could be a real game changer.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look at the other Th2 diseases that we are pursuing, the atopic derm landscape are several monoclonals, including Dupixent every 2 weeks, subcutaneous, and the JAKs that are dosed daily but have all this baggage. So again, we think we can bring a subcutaneous that can be competitive from an efficacy safety standpoint. And then if we bring an oral in, we think it is could be very disruptive in the category. So being an old drug delivery guy, um, I love these sorts of things because it can be very transformative. But in the case of 1104, not only is it really something that brings benefit to the patient, but when you couple this sort of convenience, compliance with what we thus far have seen as an incredibly clean safety profile, we've not had one patient drop out or report a serious adverse event related to the administration of 1104 across over 150 patients. So when you look at this combination of sort of TPP attributes, if you will, for the product, you get to something that is really revolutionary, if you will, in the space.
Yeah. Give me a sense for what goes on behind the curtain at Revolo to enable that change, that route of administration change. How much heavy lifting's involved, and who needs to be convinced and influenced to to want to pick up that weight and more than likely spend some money on that heavy lifting?
Well, yeah, I think, scientifically, you have to have a basis to make the argument because it's not intuitive to think that a peptide could be delivered, certainly subcutaneously, but not orally. I mean, the highway is littered with companies that have tried to deliver peptides orally. Yeah. And it's no walk in the park. So the fact that we actually did some early studies, they were well designed in an animal model that we trust, and we saw a signal, really formed the basis to say, hey, this is something that not only has value to the patient and to building a value around the program, but has a probability of success that we really need to invest in. And of course, you go to your investors and say, this is something we need to fund at least to a next milestone, because this is something that is not without risk. But if we end up with positive results, this is really a monumental driver of how we will look at our programs and what it means to shareholders and of course ultimately to the product line itself.
Yeah. Is this a case where that the industry, the space, investors hold the truth to be self-evident, so to speak, that patients would far prefer sub-Q than IV, and they'd even more prefer oral than sub-Q, or is it simply that, like, if we can do it, we all know it's going to be worth doing it? Or was there a little bit more of a, I don't know, vetting, not vetting, but a little more scrutiny around? Hey, show us the commercial opportunity numbers and how they shift and change. Like show us the pie and how the pie looks different if we can do this sublingually.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of our decision is to go out and talk with, KOLs and people who are actually, treating patients in this space and talk about what they're seeing as far as their patient experience across existing therapies. And of course, take the opportunity to speak with them around what we think might be achievable with our own program. We're always challenging ourselves to do that. And there's other real world evidence too. I mean, you see, EOE is a good example. One reason we chose EOE is because there were other modalities that were being tested, the single cytokine sort of downstream approaches in this disease, and they were failing to translate from histological impact in studies over to patient-reported outcome, which is a diary that patients fill out. And we knew mechanistically we did something very different. We thought we understand why there wasn't that translation. And so it was independent data sets being generated by some of the big pharma guys with their own programs that sort of made our case for us to pursue and where we thought we might be different. And something that physicians and patients would find as being attractive.
Mm-hmm. All right. I don't want to go too deep into the science and manufacturing, process development, formulation, that kind of stuff. But I do want to touch on it because part of that heavy lift, I'm assuming you tell me, is going to require some reformulations, perhaps a new device. Like certainly a scientific element to making the change and shift that you did. So just a little bit of color on how you navigated that. Were you leaning heavily into an outsourced partner? Did a lot of that work occur internally? Just give us again a peek behind the curtain.
Well, if you talk about the IV and sub-Q formulations are internally designed, we obviously work to actually do the work at subcontractors, but I brought on some seasoned pharmaceutical development folks and some consultants, some folks that we actually know from the past that are experts in subcutaneous delivery, and got their input, and they helped us design our studies and our formulation sort of matrix, if you will, to develop the original prototypes that ultimately went into our models that we select leads from. So on the sub-Q side, it's designed to be in a pre-filled syringe. So the idea is that the finished product will be put in the hands of the patients. And as you probably know, you look around in the GLP-1s and the Ozempics of the world and the monoclonals and what have you. There are quite a few self-administered sub-Q products in the market today. So it's become something that is much more patient friendly, and we're going to follow that game plan, if you will. On the sublingual side, because of the complexity of delivering a peptide orally, what you don't want to be doing is developing a new platform technology alongside a new chemical entity drug, because you've got two parallel tracks of risk there. So I'm not at liberty to say with who, but we went after a tried and true platform in that space. And we paid attention to the way that platform is manufactured, because there were some elements of manufacturing on the platform that we chose that allowed us to leverage some things we already knew from our manufacturer of our IV product to maximize delivery, to give us a higher chance of having a very stable product. And the data has borne out that was a good choice at this point. So we chose a tried and true delivery platform to go into.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the reception. So, we talk about acceptance, right? Like, we can naturally accept that this is a better route of administration. We'll check the numbers, but everybody's pretty sure of that. But then where the rubber meets the road, you got to see some return on the mind share investment, the commitment investment, the financial investment that you made to make this transition. So what's the output or reception been like from the scientific and capital communities?
Yeah, listen, there's been a realization that in this space, there's a long overdue. There's an overdue need for a next generation of mechanism and delivery of that. There's actually a recent New England Journal of Medicine article that really sort of starts out analyzing sort of Fasenra and its lack of meeting endpoints in this late-stage EoE trial. But within that article, they talk about the fact that although these single cytokine pathway approaches have brought a lot of good, there's still a lot of unmet need, and there's been a recognition that broader biology and working upstream is needed, and that's exactly what we bring. So there's the time is right, and the recognition that there needs to be approaches that not only hit the effector side, meaning the inflammatory piece of allergy, which a lot of these things do, steroids, the monoclonals, but bringing in the regulatory side, which is a natural regulatory mechanism of the immune system, which we do, is long overdue. And so the receptivity to that is incredible. Now, it's novel. So the other side of that is you have to prove it's safe. And you have to show that you can deliver it in a way that is receptive to patients. And that's where the drug delivery piece that we talked about comes in and sort of ties it all together.
Yeah. Do you, this is a completely speculative question. It's an unfair question for me to ask. I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit, but, maybe share how you leaned into that drug delivery experience to muster the courage, energy, conviction to make this change. Would perhaps, just given market conditions and patient receptivity, would perhaps, any CEO who maybe has some experience in this therapeutic arena, but maybe not as much drug delivery experience, have made a bold decision to do this, taken on the challenge and the risk? Or do you think you were uniquely qualified to be the guy to carry that mantle?
I do believe my background allows me to look at it a little bit differently and really to understand the risk elements. I think if thinking about when I joined the company, there was some really early data showing that we could pivot to sub-Q. To me, it was almost we have to do it because the market is going to sub-Q. And within that, this unique sort of short PK, long PD dynamic of 1104 provided a really great opportunity for us to be able to give a sub-Q and not have to give it with any, super frequency, to maybe give it every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. So it was an opportunity, but it was, okay, we need to probably go there sooner than later because the expectation is that we need to come to the market with at least a sub-Q that has a competitive profile. So the science and the data suggested that there was a very reasonable probability of success, but the motivation to do it sooner than later was pretty high, just because that's kind of the way the market is today. And so we lean into that. Now, the sublingual, I think, is a different story. Again, we took a little bit of a stepwise progression approach, just because for me to go in front of my board or investors and say, just trust me, we're going to be successful in delivering a peptide orally is not a brief conversation. So we really just had to look at it incrementally and keep saying, listen, we're going to do a little bit of work, better understand this. And then once we started rolling up the data, we kept looking at the data going, the data now is so exciting that we almost can't afford to not move it forward. So it was a gradual build of the data set to get comfortable to dive into it in a bigger way.